Clinically, I'm a child and adolescent and adult psychiatrist. I'm embedded in the adult gastroenterology division here at UPMC. My research passion is inflammatory bowel disease, and I have been studying how we can use the brain to better control both inflammatory bowel disease itself as well as the consequences, chronic pain, depression. So that's my credentials for the expertise to be up here. I'm also extremely fortunate in that I get to be part of a very innovative program here at UPMC, a subspecialty medical home for inflammatory bowel disease, where we are able to combine in GI clinic lifestyle medicine, behavioral health, at the point of GI care when these patients are coming in. We're able to get these services further to our patients through coaching models, through health technology, through telemedicine, to get them to keep them engaged in these services even when they leave the clinic. So those aren't the areas I'm going to be touching upon today, but again, exciting to talk about mindfulness, stress, and resilience, and really thinking about, where can we go in healthcare in these areas. These are my conflicts of interest. None of them conflict with what I'm going to be speaking about today. So, in 20 minutes, we're going to talk about the stress response, the relaxation response, allostatic load, resilience, and then how can we use mind-body therapies to help address all of those areas to get people to cope more adaptively. And I'm going to define adaptation here in a very simplified way, reducing stress, increasing relaxation, and increasing ultimately resilience. So the acute stress response, and much of the data on defining stress came from animal models. And when we talk about stress induction in humans, we're using pretty artificial paradigms in clinics, or we go the other extreme where we're looking at stress in patients that have so many potential confounding things going on that's sort of hard to figure out what the focus lens should be. So I took this basic on purpose, and then as I go, it'll get exponentially more and more complicated. So really, we have one main reason for why we even have a brain, and that's to keep us alive. And to keep us alive, in a very basic way, our brains have to determine when we have danger and when it's safe. And our stress response was designed to basically determine that dangerousness and then get us back to whatever safety is possible as quickly as possible so we don't die. And that's really across all species, across all organisms. That is largely driven by the sympathetic nervous system that puts us in a fight-flight mode, and that, of course, relates to a cascade of hormonal and physiological reactions in the brain and the body. Here you have some of those, again, when we're in that acute phase stress response, we have increased blood sugar so we can run faster, increased muscle efficiency. We have decreased sensitivity to pain in the short term. We can have heightened memory and attention, and suppresses really all the functions in our body that aren't needed in that particular moment to get away from the danger. Now, the acute stress response then is a physiologically adaptive response, and that stressor can come from either the outside or when bad things are happening internally in our bodies. The problem with the stress response is if it becomes a chronic state. So I know the chronic stress response the best from the brain-gut axis, but obviously we could apply this to any system in the body, where we know that when we have chronic stress, our body organs take a hit, our brain takes a hit, our immune system begins not to be able to function and mount the response it needs to. We stop destroying viruses, bacteria, tumors, irregular cells, And we start having, as you've heard in previous talks, that increased risk of all sorts of stress-related diseases, cardiovascular. We haven't actually heard about irritable bowel syndrome today. I want to make a plug for that being really a quintessential stress disorder and affects about 30 million Americans and really seen in any of your clinics, not just in gastroenterology. We have cancer, then we have our psychiatric disorders. I put depression here as an example, and obesity. Dr. Parkinson yesterday in the conference actually referred to this chronic stress state as a parasympathetic deficit disorder. And there was some very eloquent basic science work done in the 1970s. Tracy was the name, where he showed that our parasympathetic nervous system is our most powerful anti-inflammatory system in our bodies. And so when you go into a deficit, all of these things happen. And these have, I think, another point to make. We've heard about epigenetics. Stress responses can be inherited. So it's not only what your stress interactions and environmental exposures were. Actually, we carry that from how our parents and grandparents, what stressors they had and how either they succumbed to those stressors or how resilient they were. So allostatic load. So allostasis is basically the physiological adjustments we make to maintain homeostasis or stability. So it's really takes a lot of energy if, again, we are faced with chronic stress, either from within or without, and this causes wear and tear over time, over our lifetime, and we call that the allostatic load. Eventually, your system reaches a point of exhaustion and can no longer go back to that state of optimal, healthy homeostasis. Resilience is on the other end of the spectrum. It's a dynamic trait. It's the ability to cultivate adaptive responses by reducing negative effects of stress and going back to that state of well-being, so a healthy well-being. Now, I think that it's so important that a healthy reactive scope of where we are in this allostasis resilience spectrum has to do with both our capacity to have both anticipatory and predictive homeostasis, so predict what could be dangerous in the future, and then also reactive, obviously respond and get ourselves out of trouble in ongoing stress. Both are important, and resilience certainly is influenced by basically the genetic or epigenetic basis that we started with, and then also the exposure factors we've had from the environment, and those sort of really decide if our adaptive capacity is narrowed or if it actually is expanded and moved more toward resilience. So when we think about the stress response, which again is largely sympathetically driven and signifies danger, the counterpart, as I already alluded to, is our parasympathetic or relaxation response. And again, as we move toward adaptation, we're carrying an allostatic load, and that allostatic load, again, is determined by both genetic, experiential factors. It's also determined by what our behavioral response to stress has been, and much of our behavioral responses to stress are actually ingrained in the first 5 years of our lives. So it's well before you go for any formal education. I mean, and actually there's some priming of your stress response even in utero, but again, the first 5 years of life, and I think we've alluded to in the conference the importance of thinking about our children and how can we help our children develop resilience very early in life, and that's how early we really have to think to have the optimal response. So where you are on the spectrum is mediated by physiological, biochemical, immune responses, and both the stress response and the relaxation response have adaptive, innate, protective roles, and I think it is where do you find the balance that allows you to either maintain health before you get sick or return to health when the system has gone into disarray. So, what can we do? What does the research to date show in terms of effective interventions to reduce stress, improve relaxation, and resilience? So I'm going to talk about the mind-body therapies to achieve this. As you can see, we're clipping right along at a very fast pace here. There's a lot of excellent detailed research in all of the areas I've talked about, and including here, that I couldn't cover in such a brief talk. But in general, there have been well-studied mind-body techniques and therapeutic interventions in movement, yoga, tai chi, physical activity, mindfulness meditation, things like breath awareness, body scan, guided imagery, contemplation, prayer, loving kindness. And it's very fascinating. I actually got a PhD in neuroanatomy before I went to medical school, so I love brain imaging studies. I always get so excited when something new comes out. Even if you take those mindfulness modalities, the way the brain lights up in different individuals is actually slightly different depending on which modality that they're using. So while we clump these things together, I think it's so important that even here, there's a lot of room to understand what works in general and where personalization is needed. I think the one area where personalization is not studied enough is our patients who have trauma histories. Trauma, there's a lot of ways to get to a traumatized state. We know it's very bad for your stress response. It moves you further away from resilience, so that's an area that we could think about personalizing. And then the last area we are broadly calling adaptive coping. I have cognitive behavioral therapy here as just the one example I'm going to talk about. But there's sort of other modalities that basically help you use your brain to cope more adaptively, to move you toward resilience. And all of these different modalities have been shown to have positive effects on chronic pain syndromes, on inflammatory diseases of all sorts, including inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel, cardiovascular disease, cancer, migraines, osteoporosis or arthritis, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. So again, a vast literature supporting that these are chemically active and more nuanced chemically active interventions than any pill you can give. I always tell my patients that I never met a pill that could teach you how to cope of any kind. And so that's often how I lead into, so isn't it great that we have some other things to offer you? So all mind-body therapies, if we think about it now, going back to our stress lens, they're all about resetting the system from danger back to safety. And I sort of like that because I think as we think about the network project and how we're going to look at this, if we can always sort of keep that at the forefront, that the greater degree to which we can get the brain and the body from danger to safety, I think we'll have greater success. Mindfulness meditation, and it fosters an attention and acceptance toward one's present moment's experience. It's focusing you on the present moment while you're acknowledging it, accepting what's happening both in your brain and your body, characterized by curiosity, openness, and acceptance towards one's own experiences, and while those experiences are occurring. So you're really, even if it's something like pain, you're able to let it go. Now, mindfulness training takes practice to get to a point where it helps you, and every single study shows that to maintain effects, you also have to continue practice. So it's not magical. In fact, none of these behavioral mind-body interventions are magical. You actually, and we have to think about how do we make them truly part of lifestyle, because it has to become as much of a daily ritual as brushing your teeth. And with the adolescents I work with, that's when I ask them to link their work in this area, is when they're brushing their teeth, because it's something that even adolescents, all of them, most of them do. All right, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's basically taking advantage that our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and body reactions are all connected. And it's teaching you adaptive coping by helping you reappraise negative thinking and changing maladaptive behaviors. The classically techniques you hear are relaxation training and multiple ways to achieve that, problem-solving techniques, giving people locus of control, figuring out what they can and can't change, and then either adapting their behavior or their thinking accordingly. Cognitive reframing, the changing, again, the negative thinking, especially if it's extreme or persistent. There are many cognitive behavioral therapy variants out there. Acceptance and commitment therapy we hear more about, and it's getting more of a scientific basis. That's really about engendering psychological flexibility. Dialectical behavioral therapy is about emotional regulation. Again, variants on the theme of connecting those 4 domains and helping somebody to cope better and reverse the effects of chronic stress on the body by using your brain. The cognitive activation model of stress also takes advantage of the idea that, again, all our brains are doing is providing a general alarm response when there's any type of discrepancy between what we expect from a situation and what the reality is. And again, there's many different lenses and theoretical orientations out there. People give it new names because then it can become their theory. But all of them really are based on this idea that emotions, cognitions, behaviors, and body reactions are linked. And so we can actually use a top-bottom approach to help influence what's happening in our body and reverse negativity. All of these different techniques, but particularly now focusing on meditation and CBT, have been shown to have changes in brain activity, body metabolism, physiology, inflammation is really big, gut functioning, things like motility, the microbiome. So we're resetting the brain-body balance. We're resetting our autonomic nervous system, again, reversing the effects of chronic stress. Some new studies just came out that even brain trauma, so concussions, can be reversed with these kinds of mind, or the effects of concussions, I should say, can be reversed by this type of work. And as you heard earlier from Dan, improving sleep is key. The wonderful, I think, advance in getting these interventions to people out there, and these can be both patients and people in the community, given the relative, and will always continue to be a relative shortage of mental health providers, are some of the digital options that are out there. I have nothing to do with these particular companies, but here are some of the companies that have developed mindfulness products that have withstood the test of time. That means a company stays in existence at least 5 years and actually have some credible research supporting the brain-body effects that they have. So both of these offer audio, video, they're variants of guided meditations. They have reminders to help you practice. They constantly come up with new shiny object ways that keep you curious and engaged about what comes next. They are a bit one-size-fits-all, but it's a great place to start. And again, they have effect in many people. Here at UPMC, we are also now embedded into medical care, developing some of our own digital projects. Brain Manager is a digital therapeutic program that combines cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness meditation techniques, and specifically targeting stress, anxiety, and depression. And it has a coach integrated, a live coach, a health coach that is integrated into the app, and they communicate with patients by texting. So patients have that bit of social connection, and then the coaches, because they're embedded in UPMC, have coordination and communication pathways with the clinical team. Right now, we're testing Brain Manager being prescribed from the medical record by clinicians. So we're testing it in different areas of the system. So far, extremely high engagement, and in 2 months of usage, already showing reduction in anxiety, depression, and some positive physical effects. Odyssey is a mobile app, and you heard about Prescription for Wellness, which is our programs that support healthy lifestyle, things like weight management, healthy eating, exercise, also has a stress reduction component. Odyssey has taken sort of what we have learned from the coach sort of in a workbook model, digitized it, and made it into an app. These two apps now are sitting in the same place, so a clinician who prescribes these can now go into the digital tab and then find whatever program they specifically want, either Brain Manager or one of the Odyssey programs, and just like that, click, orders it for the patient, and then the usage information is fed back into the system so that clinicians can track this. And again, we're learning a lot about how you motivate individuals, how you keep them engaged in these apps, so really just to the degree that they need to ultimately return to their lives with less stress. So in summary then, in terms of when we're using mind-body therapies, they're not standalone. It's really meant, and you're going to hear about social connectivity next, but we're really talking about how can reduce stress reactivity, relaxation response, and increase connectiveness to others, increase resilience, and both reactive and anticipatory resilience. So chronic stress allostatic load can be reversed. Mind-body therapies are effective as a component in doing that, and we really need to think about building resilience. So we know that these work in a behavioral way. We need to much better understand the epigenetic, biochemical, physiological, and psychological ways, and how those biological mechanisms mediate what we see behaviorally. So the last two slides are then moving us toward our panel in terms of what I see as the questions or challenges in the area and some of the methodologies that I think we can think about developing in the field. And since I spent 25 years thinking about this, my slide might be a little bit overloaded. So heterogeneity in how stress and allostatic load and paradigms are still measured. And really, what are indices? I mean, if you're trying to have a network where adaptation or resilience are defined, where do we want to start with that? I think the important thing is that we do it in a unified way and that we have a large enough sample so that heterogeneity can be incorporated and used in predictive paradigms. There's a lack of standardization of what mind-body therapies are, and I think if we're going to get a handle on them, we sort of have to come to some consensus of, at least maybe for a first-line approach in a large population, which ones we want to use, and again, thinking about like I said, the biological and physiological mediators of whichever ones we pick. So I think we also need to determine exactly what the active ingredients are, what parts we can standardize in these approaches, but where do we need that kind of personalization flexibility? Because there is not a one-size-fits-all, thank goodness, for helping the brain achieve the best resilience. I think that when we're thinking about outcomes, we really need to think about short-term and long-term outcomes in stress reduction and increasing resilience, and differentiating response from sort of truly achieving remission and also relapse prevention, and again, using our big data and more longitudinal studies, and longitudinal studies that may have to go on for decades before we really can truly understand this. And then last but not least, as you can tell, I'm an advocate of health technologies to increase the access to and the reach of these mind-brain interventions, but I think we have to be careful not to ever edit out the relationship with the clinician, the trust and credibility that comes with that, and we have to make sure that inadvertently we aren't actually socially isolating our patients even further by getting them too connected with their apps. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Larry Wexler. As Mike knows, I've talked to him many times about been interested in brain health. I feel like a little bit of fish out of water because this isn't my main activity. My day job is I'm a stroke neurologist, but I think as a neurologist and the head of a department and the head of a service line, we have a responsibility to try to keep patients out of our office and out of our hospitals. And so, our idea is to try to keep brains healthy rather than, if they're not, we're happy to see them, but our first responsibility should be to try to keep them away from us. Thank you, Eva, for that terrific talk and for this terrific conference. I've learned a lot. But I'd like to address an issue that I've been interested in, and I'm going to relate this back to what I know best, which is stroke. But how to integrate this, and we've talked a lot about patients and getting patients on board with this, but how do we get the doctors on board with this? How do we actually change practice? This is certainly, at least in my world, not in the mainstream of medical practice in terms of preventing brain disease and particularly stroke. So, how do we, if it's difficult to change behavior in patients, it's doubly difficult to change practice among physicians. I can tell you, everyone's nodding their head because everyone knows this. I don't have to tell you that. But in stroke, you all are aware of intravenous TPA, which was, there are multiple trials and high levels of evidence going back to 1996. It took about 10 years for IV TPA to become widely used, and even now, 20 years later, there's still pockets of resistance. So it's a battle. In terms of mind-body therapies, the thing that Eva was talking about, there's very little in the stroke literature. There's a lot of literature on it, but in the mainstream stroke literature, almost nothing. And it's just beginning to be kind of integrated into the clinical trials that we're doing in stroke. But if you look at what it does for stroke prevention, the numbers are very impressive. So I'll give you one example. We've done some trials of intracranial stenosis, severe intracranial stenosis, and the first set of trials that were done, going back to 2005, comparing aspirin and warfarin, didn't show any difference between the two treatment groups, but there was a very high stroke rate in both groups. We're talking about a 22% incidence of recurrent stroke in patients who have intracranial stenosis and an initial event. Very high. So the next step was to try to test a stent to open the intracranial arteries. So a trial was done randomizing patients to stenting versus medical therapy. The medical therapy was the same as the previous study with the addition of lifestyle management. Now, lifestyle management in this case was not like anything that we're talking about. Lifestyle management consisted of somebody calling the patient once a week and saying, are you getting any exercise? What's your diet? Are you taking your medications? Great, okay, I'll talk to you next week. That was lifestyle management as defined by this trial. Even that minimal intervention dropped the stroke rate from 22% to 14%. A 40% drop in the stroke rate. Unfortunately, the stents still had a 20% stroke rate. So the stents were no good. And of course, everyone said, well, that's terrible, and particularly the stent companies. They said, gee, this doesn't really work well. We're very disappointed. But here we have an intervention that dropped the stroke rate by 40%, and nobody paid any attention to that. So if you can do that with just calling the patient once a week, imagine what you could do with some of these other therapies. So how do we change practice? I think what most clinicians, or many clinicians, I would say, depend upon are things like guidelines. In our field, where we have guidelines published by the American Heart Association, by the American Academy of Neurology, and many people who practice, or they have to deal with all kinds of neurological problems. They depend upon those guidelines to know that they are practicing what's considered the standard of care. The guidelines are based on evidence. So we need evidence for these interventions specifically in stroke. There are some in cardiovascular disease in general, but really nothing in stroke, and I think that would be the next step. There are challenges, though. I mean, to do a randomized trial, which of course is what we need for the highest level of evidence that gets incorporated into guidelines. Yes, there are new methodologies coming along that might help, but randomized trials are still the gold standard. How do you standardize these treatments? It's a challenge. How do you standardize mindfulness and meditation and yoga? How do you know everyone's getting the same treatment across a multi-center study, including hundreds or thousands of patients? How do you blind it? Very challenging to think of how you do a blinded trial and how you avoid biases. And what are the outcomes that you're going to look at? Are you looking at mortality? Are you looking at recurrent stroke? Are you looking at other types of interventions? I think that the possibilities for large, big databases, analytics, AI, that sort of thing are certainly great. Over time, I think that will perhaps replace the need for these big randomized controlled trials. To the extent that we can use that, I think for these kinds of things that we're talking about, that's going to be probably the best way to approach acquiring really high quality evidence for the effectiveness of these therapies. Biomarkers would be fantastic if we can get biomarkers that, if inflammation is the critical factor that that is responsible for the effect of these treatments, then fine. If we can get biomarkers of inflammation and that correlates with outcomes in these situations, then we're much further along. And I think we're going to be able to collect some really good evidence. So I hope this does not go the way of IVTPA. I hope we can do this in a lot less than 10 or 20 years. I look forward to learning more about the results of this conference, and I think trying to promote the kind of research that we need to get this into the mainstream. Thanks,
Larry. Barry?
Thank you, Mike. Barry Kerzin, family doc, live in the Indian Himalayas for 30 years, practiced charitable medicine for 30 years, and primarily now I'm teaching around the world. And I come back to Pittsburgh, I think it's my 7th trip, working with UPMC nurses, 18,000 of them, training them in compassion, resilience, mindfulness, now working with the police force, on and on. It's kind of really becoming my second home. Eva gave an incredible presentation. She covered really the whole, and there's so much, and she covered it very, very beautifully and very clearly. So I'd like to compliment her on that. I'd like to make a few comments, a couple first on her presentation and then on a few earlier presentations, and then a couple things of my own, and I'll try to keep it as short as I can. Let's see. Resilience, she talked about in terms of returning to well-being. So I think one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of define some of the terms that we're using. Now these, many people have different definitions, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, but this comes also from experience. I've spent probably 12 to 15 years of my life doing meditation, so I have a little bit of experience of meditation also. So well-being, what is it? Well, when I went to medical school, we were taught our job is to get rid of disease, get people back to normal. Yeah, that's a statistical term, maybe 95%, right? Actually getting people back to normal is just half the job. Our job really is to get them to flourish, to be well, to be happy, to feel good about themselves, to be resilient in the sense of returning from challenges which we all face in our lives, repeatedly, to a state of feeling good again. So I think that's really what we're all about, is human flourishing. And well-being can be described in that sense if we talk a little bit about healthy self-confidence, if we talk a little bit about emotional hygiene, which is close in many ways to CBT that Eva was talking about, but I'll define it in a little bit different way. So let's do it now. Emotional hygiene is when we first identify our harmful emotions, and basically, there are many of them, but basically talking about anger, jealousy, pride. And then after we've identified them, to learn techniques or approaches to massage or detour or transform them into their positive opposites. So we're not suppressing. So for example, the healthy positive opposite for anger would be patience or tolerance. For jealousy, it would be appreciation, feeling happy for the other person's success. For arrogance, it would be humility. And we could go on, but I'll stop there for brevity. And then working with anger, once we're full-blown angry, we can't do much. We're overwhelmed, right? So we have to learn early signs and symptoms of anger. Feeling, irritated, feeling frustrated. We've talked about sleep deprivation. Having physiologic things we can identify with, rapid heartbeat, tachycardia, change in our breathing, flushing, etc. Tension in our muscles, people describe in their jaw, their neck, or their shoulders. Some of us are feeling that now. So to learn how to be mindful in the sense of dropping into the present moment and observing our inner life, our thoughts, our feelings. And that's one way to look at mindfulness. And then using that to identify, for example, when we have these early signs and symptoms of anger. And then using a method, and here's one possible one, is to imagine that those pre-anger signs and symptoms transform into a cloud. The cloud is way over there in the sky, and it drifts, and it dissipates completely. It dissolves, along with your pre-anger. This won't work the first time. We're so ingrained since childhood to get angry. But if we do it repeatedly and we don't give up, it'll work. And I won't go into the other ones because I said I would be short. Let me move on briefly to healthy self-confidence. So the two sides, we're trying to find a middle approach here, would be putting ourselves down, and the other side would be putting the other person down, arrogance. So we talked, so arrogance, it's just a matter of recognizing that we're in an arrogant mood and a put-down mood, and we can tell ourselves this is a trap. We got to get out of this because we lose all our friends. We don't grow. We feel we know everything. We kind of die in the vine. We don't listen. We don't read. And then on the other side is putting ourselves down and recognizing this is not our stuff. In a way, it's not our stuff. It was imposed upon us by somebody else, usually when we were young. We were told, we're not good enough. We were told, you're a girl, you can't do that. Okay? So this came from somebody or some other people. So to recognize that, we can also free it up thinking with that attitude. So let me just mention those two. I'd like to mention in the case study that Mike presented of the 10-year-old African-American boy with obesity, diabetes, asthma, ADHD, and I think it was in the review of systems, something that wasn't mentioned, Mike, which I think is one of the most important thing, was that kid reported that he or she, I think it was a he, was frequently bullied. I think this was the most important factor in terms of lifestyle medicine to address. And I know you would, Mike, but it wasn't called out, and I'd like to call that out. There's some good research on epigenetics and how it shifted. So we had a lovely talk earlier by, I think his name is Taryn, is it? On some of the details. It was Torin Finkel, some of the details in terms of chromatin, how it sort of, covers the DNA and how that gets affected with this units of methylation and acetylation, and how it changes the epigenetics. What I'd like to mention is that meditation is a very powerful way to change the epigenetics positively, and there's some very good research on that. And I have some slides, yeah. So if you'll watch us very closely, this is not epigenetics, this is genetics. We're looking at telomeres and telomerase, and we're going to show what happens with aging. Could I have the next couple slides? The telomeres will shorten as the telomerase reduces. So telomerase cleans up those broken proteins and that broken DNA particularly in the telomeres to keep them long. So telomerase is good stuff. Next slide. Let's see, could you go back one? I can't see there. One more. Yeah. So it's the black bar there is meditation. Doubled, statistically significant, and doubled the rate of telomerase with meditation. This wasn't people that did 10 years of meditation. This was a short intervention. So keeping the telomeres long and therefore longevity and less chronic, age-related chronic disease. A couple more points and then I'm done. There's some fairly recent good research from Stanford Medical School that showed that kindness practiced by healthcare providers reduced the time for post-surgical wound healing. Kindness, simple to do, we forget it often, which begs the issue, we have to be feeling kind, and we're not. 60% of the medical students by third year, the research is showing, are burnt out. Okay, so we have to work on ourselves is really part of the program to be good human beings for ourselves, for our families, but of course for our patients. There's some good research, and this was mentioned by Eva in a more general sense, about inflammation improving, decreasing with meditation. And I had some slides, but I don't have them with me right now. Some good research showing that IL-6 on the y-axis of this graph, in a logarithmic scale, dramatically reduces with the amount of meditation. And IL-6 it's a complicated system, interleukin and inflammation in the immune system, but essentially, as it goes down, inflammation goes down. So that's kind of cool.
We're into cool. That's good.
You want me to wrap up? That's basically
great.
it.
Thanks, Barry.
At some point, if there's 5 to 10 minutes, we can meditate together. But you have to let me know if that's
We'll see.
if that's appropriate.
That's great. You. Thanks, Barry. Dr. Roth, Loren, bring us home, as they say.
Hey, great. I see that you put my slide up, and as I've listened to my excellent colleagues here and to Eva, I don't think I'm going to get through all my preliminary thoughts to this wonderful symposium. I wanted to read a quotation by Hans Selye, the father of stress physiology, really. And this was said in 1980. Stress, like Einstein's theory of relativity, is a scientific concept which has suffered from the mixed blessing of being overall well known and too little understood. Now, that's an interesting comment, because as I really don't work in this field, but as I thought about what I wanted to talk about, I became interested in learning myself more. Well, what is the exact definition of stress? Under the idea that if we're going to do research, which is going to be new or illustrative, we ought to have a pretty good definition of stress. But when you go to the literature, what you find is that there is some wonderful definitions of stress. Eva reviewed those very nicely, although you didn't talk about cortisol, but you had it in there, all of it, the sympathetic, the parasympathetic system, what exactly, and what it does to the body. And so my first conclusion on reading a number of papers about stress and thinking about my own stress over my lifetime was that, we understand a lot more about the physiology and progressively the molecular biology of stress and how to define and measure than we do about just plain stress as a psychological or behavioral term, because each of the papers stresses we've had a lot of time problem measuring stress. that there is an ambiguity how to measure stress. Now, I am not speaking of the stress response, and it was interesting that you, in your talk, distinguished between the idea at the end, Eva, between exposures, or in other words, what causes stress, and what are those things, so to speak, that are stressful, as opposed to the idea, or derivative related, the stress response. In other words, when the body either experiences these events or threats, or some of the examples which I will briefly allude to in my slide, then we have a stress response. But a number of the people here today have commented, not only does the doctors not understand or even be able to fully engage in this area, practically everybody has said that, I would also say neither does the public in the messages we give, because everyone is told in the healthy aging area, which always interests me, or in health generally, avoid stress. But you know, I don't know as a layperson, well, what exactly do they mean when they say avoid stress? Now, what I believe and know from what I learned earlier today, sleep relates to stress, nutrition relates to stress, exercise relates to stress, and in a way, we put the word in stress, but we don't really communicate to the public what it is we mean, per se, by stress. And I tried in this slide to give you an examples, or several examples, really, of the ambiguities that researchers have had, and which I believe the public has, in thinking about, well, how the hell do I avoid stress? You know, my whole life is stressful. Or things happen to me every day. I wonder what proportion of the day I'm stressed. Or how good is it for me to do all these work at the last minute and feel stressed? You see what I'm driving at? And I think that we would advance the field if we would take some of the concepts that Barry mentioned, some that Eva mentioned, and we put them into a little educational kit or something that when we tell the public, these are the 6 things, we're studying the 6 things of lifestyle medicine.
Right. It needs a nomenclature, it needs a codification, it needs a case definition, it needs a structure that's meaningful, not only for clinicians, for research, but for the public, right?
And for us.
Yeah,
really,
and for us.
as physicians.
Right, yeah.
Because
people in this room.
In my slide, I've indicated, look at all these different things. First of all, since I have a background in analytic philosophy, which in my maturity I've returned to as an interest, philosophers have struggled with this for years. How to even define things. And this very famous man, whose work I studied 50 plus years ago, Ludwig Wittgenstein, said, as is in the slide, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. Its use in the language. In other words, there probably is no single definition of stress. So this is a really difficult thing. And furthermore, when we talk about stress, we're talking objective things, we're talking subjective things. People vary in their propensity to stress. Stress varies enormously along a definition of its severity, its permanence, its time, its duration, etc., etc. And we're on stronger grounds definitionally when we can do something experimentally, and we're on stronger grounds when we can give a precise or at least some aspect of definitions that explain to the public what is it we're talking about. And probably the first thing we would say is you got to eat well, you got to sleep well,
right.
you got to be exercising. And these are all the ways you're going to avoid stress. But they still don't know what stress is exactly. And so what I've read and what I believe is correct, in part, stress is not only the issue of danger, but it is also stressed in the literature that it's an issue of control. Control. In other words, how can I manage my life? How can I manage my loss, for example?
Exactly.
How I contemplate, could I ever clean up my house so I could someday move, okay? But the most pertinent thing, in my experience, being interested in disadvantaged persons and medical care and the social determinants of care, is the stress of poverty. Poverty is nothing but stress. And people spend their hours coping with it, trying to get their lives and the lives of their children in order. Now that is stress. So as Eva pointed out, we have this idea of danger of fight versus flight. But I tried to give you a list of things in the bottom of the slide when neither are possible. No flight, no fight. As for example, apparently the 80% of people who every day do not want to go to work. One of the blessings of my life is I love to go to work. At least 9 out of 10 days.
Work is a health factor. Well, with that, I'm going to have to put a bow on this one, if that's okay, you guys. I appreciate the panel.
Okay. Well, I'm done.
Loren, I'm following the slide, which is great. I think, though, if I can, from the very first comment that Larry made about something as precipitous and episodic, you might think, as a stroke, that the clear definition, to your point, Loren, through Barry's comments, is the definition of what is stress in a meaningful, medical, studyable, researchable way would be very helpful to inform our research funders as to we think this is the pathway forward. So I think we heard some real gems. Eva, thanks again. Wonderful. A round of applause for this group. Thank you very much.